So as we continue to walk through all that happens in Exodus, some of the passages will be very familiar to you. You know, the plagues, walking across the Red Sea, all of that are very familiar. But then there are some passages that are largely unfamiliar to a lot of us. As you read through, you go, oh, I didn't know where that was. There's a lot that happens in between these major events. And today we're going to focus in on an absolutely major event, but we're going to fill in some gaps as well. So the lesson last week was a bit of a downer because the Israelites are constantly complaining. They're constantly grumbling against God. I mean, it's been like a few days since all the events of Egypt and crossing the Red Sea and all these amazing things that happen. And they get to the other side, and I mean, almost day one, like, hey, I know that God miraculously saved us from slavery and all that's great, but I'm hungry. So what's for lunch? Just immediate. And we've seen now how of these events of the Exodus, especially this provision of bread and water, how those are connected to Jesus. Spent some time last week looking at that, because we always want to be aware of how the Old Testament is pointing us towards Christ, who he is and what he has come to do. So God provides this physical bread, this physical sustenance for the Israelites in the desert. Jesus picks up on that, and John, in the Gospel of John, it says, I'm the bread of life. Just as that came down from heaven to feed them, I have come down from heaven to provide fulfillment and sustenance to you. So there's this metaphorical aspect of that we rely on him. It's also in part what we do every Sunday when we take communion together. We are reminding ourselves that we rely on him, that he is the one who fulfills us. So as we've walked through some things chronologically, we've jumped over a couple of events. When you looked at Exodus 17, he talked briefly about Moses striking the rock at Meribah to provide water for the people. But you didn't look at the first battle that the Israelites faced now in their freedom. The Amalekites were descendants of Esau, and they bring an army against Israel. And Joshua, the commander, marshals this army while Moses, Aaron, and Hur watch up in a nearby hill. And while Moses has his staff of God held up, the Israelites were winning, but when he lowers it, the Amalekites begin to win. So he can't hold it up the whole time. His arms get tired, so Aaron and Hur hold up his arms so that for hours on end, so that the Israelite army will prevail. Again, this is God continuing to provide over and over and over again for all of his people. And there, Moses built an altar, named it Yahweh Nisi, the Lord is my banner, because God had gone before his people. He brings victory in the battle. And after the Amalekites were defeated that day, God promised that he would blot them out in the future. It takes a while. We'll see them pop up several more times, but he does eventually erase them from the face of the earth. In Exodus 18, we read of Moses being reunited with Jethro, his father-in-law, and he witnesses Moses being overwhelmed because he's the leader. He's now judging all of the disagreements and arguments that happen within all of the Israelites. Now remember, there's a couple million of them. There's a lot of people. And anytime they disagree, which people tend to do, they all come to Moses for him to settle the issue or to take it up the mountain before God. And Jethro looks at that from a distance and said, that's really foolish. You can't handle all of that. You need to surround yourself with some good and godly men and let them command over all of that, and let people start at kind of that lowest rung. And if it gets up to you, then it's like the really serious stuff, very difficult maybe, or serious legal issues. And that's the beginning of how Israel begins to be governed as God uses his people to govern the rest of his people. So today we're going to focus on Exodus 19 and 20. Now, we'll look at a couple of different passages as well. This is the giving of the law to Israel. This is the Ten Commandments of all that happens there. And we're going to spend some time unpacking a bit the purpose of the Old Testament law and how even today we are to relate to the Old Testament law. We're New Testament Christians, so what's our role there? The Israelites now move further south and east, and they come into the region where Moses had been a shepherd for 40 years in the wilderness of Midian. Because when God met him there in Exodus 3, God had told him, you'll come back and you'll worship on this mountain. Well, now they're coming back to that area, to the area known as Mount Sinai. It's also known as Horeb, the mountain of God. So they're coming now into this region. And again, if you've ever watched the famous movies about what happens in this moment, these are very dramatic moments, but we don't let Hollywood dictate what happens and what's said. We go to the text to do that, because no matter how faithful they try to be to the text, they always muck it up. So we don't trust Hollywood. We trust in the scriptures. So there might be some differences that you'll pick up on, and we'll kind of do a flyover of the events, and then we'll come back and we'll settle in. Chapter 19, verse 1. In the 3rd month after the sons of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on this day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. Then they set out from Rephidim and came to the wilderness of Sinai and camped in the wilderness, and there Israel camped in front of the mountains. Now Moses went up to God, and Yahweh called to him from the mountain, saying, Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the sons of Israel, You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I lifted you up on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So now then, if you will indeed listen to my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my treasured possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the sons of Israel. Now, let's be reminded, Israelites left Egypt on the 14th of the 1st month. And now this happens just a little bit later, so it's a pretty condensed time frame. It's only a couple of months now since they've been set free. Moses, right after this, comes back down the mountain. He reports into the Israelite elders. Here's what God has said. They all agree that they're going to follow God's word. They're going to keep his covenant. Now, they don't at all. They constantly violate it, but they mean well. Yes, we trust God. He's rescued us. And then God will command any creature that touches this mountain, I'm going to kill. So don't let any person, don't let any animal touch the mountain. This is a holy mountain. I'm here. My physical presence is here. And if you come up and touch that and violate those boundaries of my presence, they will die. God tells Moses, have the people consecrated. Set them apart to prepare them, because God is going to speak and you need to be ready to listen. Chapter 19, verse 16. So it happened on the 3rd day, when it was morning, that there were thunder and lightning flashes and a thick cloud upon the mountain and a very loud trumpet sound, so that all the people who were in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet God, and they stood at the foot of the mountain. Now Mount Sinai was all in smoke, because Yahweh descended upon it in fire, and its smoke ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. And the sound of the trumpet grew louder and louder. Then Moses spoke, and God answered him with thunder. And Yahweh came down on Mount Sinai to the top of the mountain. And Yahweh called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. What a frightening moment. For the remainder of the chapter, Moses, again, comes back down. He warns the people again about approaching the mountain. God speaks and delivers what we know as the 10 Commandments. Literally, it's the 10 words that God offers to the people. Chapter 20, verse 18. And all the people perceived the thunder and the lightning flashes and the sound of the trumpet and the mountain smoking, and the people perceived it, and they shook and stood at a distance. Then they said to Moses, "Speak to us yourself, and we will listen, but let not God speak to us, lest we die." And Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may be with you, so that you may not sin." So the people stood at a distance, but Moses came near the dense gloom where God was. Most of chapter 20 is the delivery of the Ten Commandments, and we'll look back at that section after we kind of do this bird's eye view. Moses then goes back up the mountain. God delivers to him the civil laws that will govern the normal everyday life of Israel. And that's when you're reading through the Old Testament law, that's when it gets pretty heavy and very, very specific about how these laws are supposed to go and what the kind of clothes you can wear, the dietary restrictions, all those are civil laws. That's chapters 21 and 22. Flip ahead over to chapter 24. Verse 3. Then Moses came and recounted to the people all the words of Yahweh and all the judgments, and all the people answered with one voice and said, "All the words which Yahweh has spoken we will do." And Moses wrote down all the words of Yahweh. Then he arose early in the morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain with 12 pillars for the 12 tribes of Israel. And he sent young men of the sons of Israel, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as peace offerings to Yahweh. And Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and the other half of the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read it in the hearing of the people, and they said, "All that Yahweh has spoken we will do, we will be obedient." So Moses took the blood and sprinkled it on the people and said, "Behold the blood of the covenant which Yahweh has cut with you in accordance with all these words." Now in that you're going to hear some familiar language. The covenant of my blood. And cutting a covenant, and we've seen that phrase a number of times. You cut a covenant. Why? Because there's a sacrifice involved. So they're literally physically cutting an animal as they're making a covenant with God. So they're cutting covenants. And this idea that this covenant, I define covenant as contract plus relationship. So here's some contract nature. You do this, I'll do this. I do this, you do this. So I've saved you, brought you out of Egypt. Now you need to obey these commands. There's kind of a contractual nature to that. Plus relationship. And that part matters because when the contract is violated, the relationship will save the contract. So they're going to violate it all the time. As we will continue to walk through the Old Testament, all they do is violate the covenant. They do not obey God's laws. And yet God will continue to forgive. He will continue to save. But he uses this phrase, the blood in this covenant, or the covenant in this blood. Jesus will use that same language at the Last Supper. As he takes the cup and passes it around, "This is my blood of the covenant, shed for you." Alerting us, there's now a new relationship with God, a new covenant. Which is why it's Old Testament and New Testament. The word testament is the word for covenant. So there's an old covenant, an old relationship with God governed by the law. There's now a new covenant, a new relationship with God that's governed by the work of Christ on our behalf. And we'll get into the details of that later, even in this, but certainly as we move forward. Moses writes down everything that God told him on the mountain. He explains it to the people. They offer a sacrifice, and they affirm the covenant. They sprinkle the blood from the sacrifices. Moses and Aaron's the high priest, Nadab and Abihu, that are his sons, and the 70 elders, they go up the mountain. They see God in a limited sort of a way, and they eat the covenant meal in his presence. So they cut the covenant, they offer the sacrifice, they have the big barbecue, that's what that is, and then they eat it with God. And they, again, think, 4th of July. That's what you do. Theirs is a bit more serious than ours, but that's what's happening. They're eating these animals that have been sacrificed as the sign of the relationship they now have with God. God then calls Moses back up the mountain and tells him that he'll be given these tablets of stone. So again, remember the movie, Charlton Heston comes walking down, he's got the tablets, and all that. That's what is on them, the commandments and the law. So the 10 commandments are on there, and many of these civil laws are on there. Moses is up there for 40 days. So think what's happening from the vantage point of the base of the mountain. You're just one of the Israelites. There's fire, there's smoke, there's thunder and lightning, there's a constant earthquake. The whole mountain trembles as God descends. Moses goes up, he disappears into the cloud, and you don't see him for 40 days. You have no idea what's happening in that cloud. Has God killed him? Is he breathing? What are they talking about? I'm scared to death. I can't imagine what he's sensing as he's up there in the very presence of God. 40 days. And while he's there, he receives all the instructions to construct the tabernacle, which we're going to describe in great detail in the chapters to come. But we'll wait for a couple of weeks for that lesson to come. But then a crazy thing happens that you just kind of shake your head at. Moses has been on the mountain for 40 days, and while he's gone, what is it that the Israelites do down in the camp at the base of the mountain? The golden calf. Bunch of idiots. So they don't know what's happened to Moses. What do? We're scared to talk to God. We're not going to ask him anything. So they go to Aaron, the high priest. What are we going to do? How are we going to worship? So Aaron just blows it. He says, give me all your gold. That's all the gold they brought out of Egypt. It's their wealth. And he melts it down, fashions the golden calf, and says to them, behold your God that brought you out of Egypt. That's how you get in trouble, is you say stuff like that, and then I love it. So let's skip ahead and look at chapter 31. God gives the tablets to Moses. It's chapter 31, verse 18. When he had finished speaking with him upon Mount Sinai, he gave Moses the 2 tablets of the testimony, tablets of stone, written by the finger of God. So Moses didn't etch this, God did. This is in God's personal handwriting, which is just awesome. And he comes walking down the mountain with it. And God says to Moses, you need to go back down, because they have violated already the covenant. And God says, you're going to go back down, and here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to kill them all. The whole nation. I saved them. I did all of this to Egypt. And now, what are they doing? They're doing the very thing that Egypt had done. They're worshiping false gods. They've profaned my name after all that I've done. So I'm going to kill them all, and Moses, I'll start over with you. And we'll just do a new nation. Moses intercedes for Israel. Moses stands in the place of Israel and says, don't do it. Don't kill them all. They deserve it, sure. But what will happen when Egypt hears about it? What will happen when all the surrounding nations hear about it? He was strong enough to rescue them, but not strong enough to keep them. He took them out to the desert just to kill him. He's a liar because he made false promises. God, your reputation, which is glory, the weight of your name, is in jeopardy if you do all of that. And Moses steps in and saves their lives. I would imagine the day will come in the not too distant future, Moses will regret having done that, because it's going to happen again. He will have to do it over and over and over again because they are just really goofy. And he comes down and sees what's happening, with the golden calf, again, which we'll see in the weeks to come again. They are committing gross idolatrous sins. The text that Exodus will use was that they had risen up to play, which has strong sexual connotations to it. So essentially what's happening is an idolatrous orgy of the nation of Israel at the base of Mount Sinai, while Moses is on top of the mountain talking with him face to face. Utter craziness. Moses comes down, sees what's happening in anger, throws the tablets, and busts them. As the sign of judgment, God's word is null and void to you because you don't even listen. And then he confronts Aaron. It's one of my favorite parts. You know, what are you doing? I mean, I can't imagine what was going through your head. And do you remember what Aaron says? I took this gold and I threw it in the fire and this calf just popped out. Nobody believes that. So, again, in an act of judgment, Moses grinds down the golden calf, sprinkles it on the water, and makes the nation drink it. Again, this extreme act of judgment and condemnation against them. He goes back up the mountain, gets another copy of the Ten Commandments, and comes back down. They are later placed inside the Ark of the Covenant, where they will remain. And we'll look closely at that one in the next lesson. So let's think about the things we've just read, ask some questions. Have you paid attention to how much time has passed? From the Exodus to now the giving of the law. How far are we into this deal? 2 months-ish. So you don't have to do the homework. I did. You're welcome. So they're operating by a lunar calendar, full moons, all of that. They leave on the first one. They're now in the third one. So that's 2 months, 29 or 30-day cycle. 14 more days added to that for the next new moon. He's delivered the law on the third day of consecration. So what this means is 46 days has passed since the Exodus. A month and a half. So these are people who personally witnessed the 10 plagues. These are people who personally witnessed the Passover and the death of the firstborn. These are the people who personally walked across on dry ground as God parted the Red Sea. These are the people who watched the Red Sea come back over and kill the Egyptian army. 6 weeks later, this is what they've done. Yep, really simple. They simply, this is what sinners do. We sin. All these things take place near Sinai, again, or Horeb. The exact location of Mount Sinai is not known. The region is certainly known, but it could be any one of a handful of different mountains. There are some good candidates for sure. So, do they know, as they worship this golden calf, do they know this is sinful? We shouldn't worship an idol. Yes, they know this. They know the condemnation that's already happened on Egypt for worshiping idols. They've received the commandments directly from God, and they watched Egypt condemned for their idolatry, and yet they still do it. This is the pervasive nature of sin, is it not? We can watch other people commit sin and we see the destructive nature of it, and yet we still do it. The Apostle Paul in Romans 7 will say, these things that I want to do, I don't do them. These things that I don't want to do, I do them. And perfectly sums up for us the struggle with sin. And this is the Apostle Paul, that outside of the Lord Jesus is the greatest Christian to walk the face of the earth, and says, I'm the chief of sinners, and outlines this struggle in Romans 7. So they know this and yet continue to do it, even in the physical presence of God. He's revealed himself with cloud and with fire. and even with physical manifestations of God in their midst, they still violate all of it. So God had set them free. Notice, we have to get this right, because it will come into play later in the New Testament. The law doesn't come first, and then salvation. Salvation comes first. Then he gives them the law. I've saved you through no righteous act that you had done, not because you were this great nation and I needed your name on my resume. I saved you. I crushed Egypt. I carried you out on eagle's wings. Now, on the other side of the salvation I've provided, I give you this law. It's no different for New Testament. In this new covenant, salvation initiates the process. Through no righteous acts we had done, the Lord has saved us. And now, in response to our salvation, there's commands to follow. It's not follow the commands so that you'll then be saved. It's because you've been saved, now you need to follow these commands. If you get that order wrong, you lose Christianity in general. It's gone completely. And that's the danger. So even in the Old Testament, as popular and well known as the law is, salvation came first. Then comes the law. So in your homework, you're going to look a bit more closely at the commandments and that covenant that the Lord gave. You're going to walk through some of those things. And in the 10 commandments alone, just in those 10, 9 of those 10 carry the death penalty in different circumstances. Only one of them never carries the death penalty, and that's the sin of coveting. When you sinfully desire what someone else has, which oddly enough is the one particular sin that Paul draws out in the book of Romans and says, I wouldn't know what sin was if the law hadn't told me. I wouldn't know what coveting was if the law didn't tell me, do not covet. So, there's death penalties. This is a big deal, and that's just 10 of the laws. Throughout the entire Old Testament, there are 613 of them. God is very serious about his laws. He's got a lot of them. These are explicit commands directly from God. So because they're so clear and very serious, again, death penalty everywhere throughout the Old Testament, what that tells us is God is not giving a set of suggestions. If you feel like it, here's what you should do. These are explicit commands based on God's nature, God's holiness. His holy character is the standard of reference for the Israelites and their law. So there's a lot to consider with all of this for sure, and again, we'll continue to walk through it in the weeks to come. But the primary issue for us today is how do we as New Testament Christians respond to and interact with the Old Testament law? And there have been different schools of thought, different denominations hold different ideas. Some would say just dismiss the Old Testament. You don't even need it. So you can just sort of ignore that. It's a really big part of your Bible, 3/4 of it to be exact. And the first 75% of God's revelation to you, don't even read because it doesn't apply to you. Let's just start with Jesus. We like him better. He's so nice. He's so kind. So let's talk about, how he stood in defense of the woman caught in adultery, and let's talk about the cross and all of that. We don't need to worry about all of these other things. There are others who would say, even as New Testament Christians, you have to obey all 613. So they go to the other extreme, that if you don't adhere to all of these, you're not really a Christian. And that's simply not the case. Neither one of those are true. The truth is somewhere in the middle. And how the Old Testament relates to the New, one of the major divisions of theology has to deal with that. How do the two covenants relate together? How does your Old Testament and New Testament play nicely in the sandbox? How does that work? And on the one hand, there's what's called dispensational theology. And on the other hand is what's called covenant theology. And there are 6 different views within those. It's kind of a spectrum of how everything plays, what laws you are obligated to keep, even from the Old Testament. What's the role of Israel? Is Israel still the covenant people of God? Has the church replaced Israel? So there's all kinds of stuff in there that good and godly people disagree on, and that's okay. They're not all right because they have conflicting views. Somebody's got to be wrong. So let's talk a little bit about all of that. What we do know is this. The standard of the law is unattainable. You cannot keep it. Here's how I know. Because I don't want to, unjustly condemn you. You're wonderful, great people. Stop sinning. Just stop. Stop it. Now. Just never again will you sin. Some of you in your head, in response to what I just said, you sinned. You can't, can you? No. So if perfect obedience to the law of God is the basis of your salvation, can you ever be saved? No. Was perfect obedience to the law the way to be saved in the Old Testament? No. It couldn't be, because no one would ever have been saved, because perfect obedience is unattainable for anyone. How was anybody saved in the Old Testament? No, nobody was perfect, right? They're saved the same way you are, by grace through faith. The New Testament twice picks up on Abraham as the model of even New Testament salvation. Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Faith in God is what saves. Your obedience comes after, not before. So we can't begin to think, some of these Jews who were saved, they were just exceptional. God's standard is perfection. They met it. No, they did not. There is one Jewish man in the history of the world who met that. Do you know his name? Jesus. No one else has or ever will meet that law perfectly, except for the Lord Jesus, who did, who's faithful to the end, which is what qualified him to stand in our place at the cross and represent us perfect, because we would never be so. And by his sinless life and sacrificial death, now people are saved. So you've got Matthew 22 mentioned in your notes. We won't turn to it now. But the Pharisees come to Jesus. They're trying to trip him up. What's the most important law? There's 613 of them. So how do you pick one? Well, that's what all the religious scholars did. That's all the Jews did. All they did was argue about the rank-ordered list of the 613. And how you were viewed and what different Jewish school or camp you would find yourself in is based on what you said were the top laws. So the Ten Commandments are divided into two groups of laws, referred to by some scholars as the two tables of the law, the two tablets. On the one hand are the first four commands that regulate your relationship with God. On the second are the back six commands that regulate your relationship with people. And in Matthew 22, Jesus summarizes all of God's commands by summarizing those 10. He summarizes the first four of regulating your relationship with God with what command? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. This is the first and greatest command. And love your neighbor as yourself. He summarizes the back six with a passage out of Leviticus. So if you follow those two, you will follow all 613. Now, has anybody ever perfectly obeyed those two? We don't even have to get overwhelmed with 613. It's two. It's just two. And yet, no one could ever be found righteous in God's eyes for those two commands, except for the Lord Jesus, who perfectly fulfills that in all ways. That's the summary of God's commands. So we look at the law, and we look back on it now as saved people, saved by grace through faith in the risen Lord Jesus Christ, set free from the power of sin, empowered by the indwelling presence of God the Holy Spirit, something the Old Testament Israelites did not have. We have. All of us. There were only a few who were anointed. Kings were anointed. Prophets were anointed. Priests were anointed. No one else. Very few people in the Old Testament are spoken of as having the Spirit. And now in the New Testament, all who trust in Christ have him. The empowerment that comes from God dwelling within. So now we look back at the law and we're not scared. We're not oppressed by it. We don't live with this constant threat of eternal condemnation because the law hangs over us. We've been set free from that condemnation. Romans 8:1. There is therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. The law of the Spirit of life set me free from the law of sin and death. We're set free from that. So now in freedom and with power, we can look back at that law and go, how is it that God would want us to live? Because this is based on his nature. It's based on his holiness. How would God command us to live? Many of them brought explicitly into the New Testament. So you've got a few breakdowns of God's law. Of those 613, you'll have the civil laws. You can't wear shirts that are mixed fabrics. Do those apply today? I hope not, because I bet you don't have a 100% cotton shirt on. There's probably something else thrown in there. So you'd be in violation of God's law. Now, why do those laws matter? Because people were to be holy. You can't be mixed with the nations. Even your clothes are to reflect that. There's a reason for these laws. Dietary restrictions. You can't eat unclean meat. You can't have pork. Anybody have pork this week? Sinners. Straight to hell, all of you. So there are obviously some laws that we don't look back and go, oh, well, that applies today. Thankfully, we're free from all that. Go have bacon at lunch, because you can. Just, free. So you can do that. There is the ceremonial, so there's the civil, there's the ceremonial and sacrificial laws as the second category. So the instructions on keeping the Passover celebration. The instructions about the Feast of Booths. How many goats to sacrifice? You're not sacrificing goats. I mean, if you are, please talk to one of the elders when we're finished here. So we look back and go, okay, we don't have to do that. We don't have to offer pigeons, and we don't have to take Nazirite vows. We don't have to do all of that. So those don't apply to us. So when Jesus says, don't think that I came to abolish the law and the prophets, I came to fulfill them, that's what he means. That pointed to me. You don't have to sacrifice lambs anymore because I am the sacrificed lamb. It all pointed to me. So he is the final and ultimate sacrifice. Read Hebrews. That's what it's about. So it's why we don't do that. But there's civil, there's ceremonial and sacrificial, and third, there's moral law. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Those we keep. Not to earn God's approval or favor, but because we've been saved, which is why the Jews followed those laws as well. It's not because those laws are governing our society. They don't. It's because those laws are based in the very nature of God himself, and he has not changed. So we look back and go, yeah, we follow the moral law. This is how we follow God and honor his holiness in our lives. So this is why the law is a gift, because it opens up for us how we can honor God in our lives, because we follow his law. So as you read through the Old Testament, you read all these laws, it's pretty clear you will see which category they fall into. And the moral ones are quite explicit. Many, again, not all, but many of them are explicitly brought into the New Testament, which would make them binding on a New Testament Christian anyway. but the moral law is binding. We are not to violate that. We don't go out and shoot people this afternoon because we're New Testament Christians, and we don't have to follow that stupid thou shalt not murder. It's just not how it works. So God has saved, therefore we live in a holy way. So, you've got some homework. We've got a few minutes. Are there some questions you have? Yes? Yep. Sure. Yeah, let's talk about that. So for those who are watching online, the question was about the Sabbath. How do we honor the Sabbath today as New Testament Christians? So yes, the Jewish Sabbath was on Saturday. It was sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. That shifted over for the New Testament. They began to worship on the first day of the week on Sunday to honor the resurrection of Jesus from the dead. That's why you're at church on Sunday and you didn't go yesterday. That's why. And we've done that historically since the first century, since the book of Acts. We know that they did that. So we've switched over to honor that. So the Sabbath, this day of rest, that as Americans we desperately need to learn and figure out how to implement. As we'll see as we walk through not just the giving of the law here in Exodus 20, the Ten Commandments are given again in Deuteronomy 5. Deuteronomy is the summation of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. It's an overview of all that's happened. And it's Deuteronomos. Deutero's second nomos is law. It's the second giving of the law. So that's what's happening in Deuteronomy. The context of the Sabbath in Deuteronomy 5 is their slavery in Egypt. So the reason you take a day off is because you're not slaves anymore. And you need to acknowledge that you've been set free. So the Sabbath begins in creation. God takes off the seventh day to rest from all of his works. Now, did God get tired creating everything and need to take a nap? No. He sets it up as a pattern for his creation to follow. Not just his people, his land. Pay attention as you read the Old Testament law. There are Sabbath laws for the land itself. It needs a break. So every 7 years, you can't farm that land. You have to do a different field. Give it a break. Let it rebuild its nutrients that you're sucking out of the ground when you grow your crops. If you read carefully through the Babylonian captivity, why did they have to do 70 years in Babylon? Well, God is clear, so that my land can make up for its Sabbaths. That's why it's 70 years. So they had violated all of that, so God lets Israel have a break, the land of Israel have a break until they come back and start farming it again. So this habit and rhythm of work and rest is commanded by God, set as an example by God. So does that mean it is sinful to work on Sunday? Well, the person currently answering your question is working on Sunday. I am currently at work. You may not think that, but I am. My weekend is Friday and Saturday. I work Sunday to Thursday. If you go to lunch today out at a restaurant, don't you dare say that nobody can work on Sunday. You're a hypocrite if you're being served by people working on Sunday, because they're all working on Sunday. So we go to the words of Jesus. Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. We're not meant to serve that day legalistically as the Jews did. They come up with all these laws. You read the New Testament of a Sabbath day's journey. You can only walk so far. After that, it's considered work, and you've violated the Sabbath. That's not in the Bible. They just fabricated that. So we don't adhere to this legalistic nature of I have to take a day off. We adhere to the principle of the Sabbath. Take a day and rest. Mine is not Sunday. Mine is Friday. So I take Fridays off. I don't do much on Fridays. I'll do some yard work, sure, but I am not doing the requirements of my job on that day. I'm not a slave. I am free from all of that. My worth and value is not found in what I produce in my job. It's found as being a loved child of God. And I'm reminded on that day that the world will spin if I don't go to work. The job will still get done even though I don't go to work. That's the whole point. So historically, a 5-day work week is relatively new. So the reason you have a 5-day work week is because the American governmental authorities couldn't decide whether they were going to honor the Jews or honor the Christians, so they did both. So Saturday and Sunday are both off work. That's why you have a weekend. So throughout history, it's work 6, take 1 off. So find a day so that you can rest. And on that day, you do no work. So here's, I read this years ago that I always thought was a good thing. If your job is more physical, and you're doing whatever at a factory, or you're outside doing whatever it is that you do, you people that have physical jobs. I sit and type for a living. So if your job is physical, on your Sabbath, don't do physical work. Read a book. Rest. Sit. Take a break from the physical labor. If your job is more intellectual, where you read and type and sit and have meetings for a living, on your Sabbath, do something physical. Do the opposite, because that will refresh you because you've been sitting all week long. That's me. So I like to do yard work purposely on my day off because I need to get out of an office. I need to see the sun, especially now as it's coming up later and going down earlier. I have to do all of that. So the whole point is we don't get legalistic about if it's not on Sunday, we're sinning. That's not true. If you're not doing it, you're sinning. God cares very much about the Sabbath. Remember, it's based in his nature. He did this. We don't get a free pass. We're not more important to his creation than he is. So that's the reminder we need. And in a very busy culture like ours, honor it. Take the day and be reminded that it's not about you. Make sense? Okay, we're now out of time because we've got a whole group of people who have to get in here. So 1, 2, 3, go team.